The story begins in the late 2000s when an author and former policeman, David Paulides, was on vacation visiting an undisclosed national park, though thought to be Yosemite. He stated that during a conversation struck up with two off-duty park rangers, they told him about a number of odd disappearances that had occurred within the national park system. David took an interest and in the beginning contacted the National Park Service with a Freedom of Information Act request. He asked for the list of people who had gone missing in the park over the years. Specifically, David knew that the Park Service had federally trained law enforcement branches known as the United States Park Rangers and the US Park Police. Given that, it led David to the conclusion that they should have records of all missing persons within their individual jurisdictions, and should adhere to the terms of a FOIA request. To his surprise, he said that he was questioned by an attorney for the Park Service as to why he was interested in obtaining such a list. He was told that he'd get the information, but that they were curious as to why he wanted it. He told them that it was for the purpose of research, and over a number of exchanges, he was eventually told that no such records existed. David said that he questioned what it would take to obtain a comprehensive list of missing persons in the park system, and he was told that for Yosemite alone, it would cost around $34,000, and for all of the national parks, $1.4 million. David found this to be suspicious and wondered if the national park system was being deliberately uncooperative and trying to hide certain statistics. One might imagine that sharing such details might be bad for business. Others, however, have argued that the high cost might have been due to a lack of a centralised system for this matter at the time, meaning that employees would have to manually and painstakingly sift through all of the old case files across all of the parks. All of this may have changed in more recent times though, as there is a website maintained by the National Park Service in which they detail various missing person cases within the parks. Since David's initial communications with them, the cases he found were numerous enough that he has since managed to publish over 10 books and a number of movies detailing various missing persons from all over the parks, and from some other countries too. These disappearances, according to David, defy a logical explanation and meet a set criteria, known as the missing 411 profile points, established through observations over many cases. These profile points have evolved over the years, but as a general description, it includes people who have vanished, generally in rural or remote wilderness regions, many of which seem to occur in boulder fields or near bodies of water. The person goes missing quickly and inexplicably after a point of separation, and are on occasion later found miles away from where they were last seen. In some cases, also involving young people, they return reportedly confused or dazed with no clear memory or gaps in their memory as to their time spent missing. In many of these cases, the individual will vanish without any clear signs as to where they went and without any signs of a struggle or animal predation. In some instances, a person's belongings will be found during the search, notably, and weirdly sometimes, the shoes will be found abandoned. This includes situations in which hypothermia should not have been a factor. Professional search dog handlers will be brought on scene, but their dogs either fail to pick up a scent, suddenly lose a scent, or behave oddly. They will either circle an area or seem to be distracted. Large-scale search efforts by multiple agencies often fail to locate the missing person, and on some occasions that a person is found, they are found in an area that has been previously searched, in some cases many times over, dozens in fact. Of the individuals who were found after having passed away, they are without any indications of an injury, which would point to an obvious accident or animal involvement. There are more profile points than this, but this gives a good indication of the types of disappearances that can be found within the missing 411. These cases have been going on for a long time, and some of them are just outright weird and bizarre. To highlight this, let's go back to 1868, northern Michigan. At that time, a young girl, 3, by the name of Katie Flynn, was playing at her father's lumber camp near Walhalla, Michigan. Despite her young age and limited walking ability, she liked to hop into a lumber cart, which would be pulled by horses a short way down a hill near to where her father was milling. Upon reaching the bottom, she would run back to the top and repeat the ride. On the day in question, Henry Flynn, the father, after watching Katie play this game, realised that on one trip she was not with the horses. Alarmed, he began searching around the area and grew increasingly frustrated and worried as he called out to her, but he never received a response. By a stroke of coincidence and luck while he was searching, he came across a group of hunters nearby. Hearing the commotion, they asked him what was going on and then promptly joined the search for Katie. This search party now comprised of multiple people, and they scoured the forest in various directions in the vicinity of the lumber camp. After some time, they heard cries emanating from the dense brush miles away from the point at which they'd started. As they began their approach, one member of the group caught the sight of a large creature which he only got a glance at and thought that it might have been a bear. This bear took off at a high pace and crossed the river and disappeared from view into the forest. Upon reaching the sound, they found Katie alive and well, though clearly startled and affected by the ordeal. She described getting to the bottom of the hill with the horses when a big dog approached her and took her in its arms and walked away with her in tow. During the ordeal, she had lost her hat, and when questioned about it, she said that Mr. Wolf ate it. She also told her father that the wolf had fed her berries and kept her warm. I'm not sure how a bear, or a wolf, would go about feeding a person berries. Notably, this was not the only such disappearance of its kind. 24 years after the incident with Katie, in 1892, a remarkably similar incident unfolded once again in northern Michigan. I found this article on the topic by the Harrisonburg Rockingham Register. It details that another young girl by the name of Fleming, 3, lived with her parents in Michigan. It appears that at some point she had left the house without her parents realising. They went outside and saw her footprints before they were suddenly replaced with that of a bear's. They were able to track these prints 200 yards away from the house, which led into the forest. The parents were obviously horrified, and the father, alongside neighbours, put together a group to go in and retrieve the girl. They searched until it got dark, and then had to wait until the morning, I'd imagine thinking that was just the end. Similar to Katie, they heard some cries coming from a swamp area and went towards it. Suddenly, they heard a loud splash, and they could see Fleming standing on a log that was stretched over a pond. None of the adults had actually seen the bear at any point, but Fleming said that it had just jumped into the water and swam away. Fleming was unharmed and said that it looked after her. That incident must have invoked a strong sense of déjà vu for anyone at the time who knew about Katie's disappearance. 63 years later, in 1955, another young girl by the name of Ida Mae Curtis went through something extraordinarily similar too. Ida was 2 and her father worked at a lumber camp, in which her family had set up a tent and were camping while the father worked. One night, Ida's 2 older siblings ran to their mother and reported that they'd seen something big enter the tent. After sprinting back, Mrs. Curtis got a glimpse of what she said was a huge creature holding Ida with one arm, and then it ran into the thicket. It's important to clarify that Mrs. Curtis had never seen a bear before and wasn't sure it was a bear, but after giving her account of what had just happened, people assumed that it must have been one. A huge group went into the forest to search for Ida, but they could not locate her that night. The sheriff, Ray Frost, expressed skepticism and essentially said that this would not have been the work of a bear, and instead offered that if a bear was to blame, it would be more likely that it had scared her and caused her to run into the woods. Ray Frost just being incredibly helpful there. Anyway, the day afterwards, she was found about 300 yards away from the camp after searchers had heard her cries. Ida had been placed into a small hole in the ground and was recovered without injury. It's just interesting again that nobody had actually seen the bear, aside from Mrs. Curtis and Ida's older siblings, who couldn't properly identify what it was because they personally had never seen one before. The final case of this particular nature that I'll discuss happened in much more recent times. That being the case of Casey Hathaway, which I'll summarise here, but I'll leave a link in the description to my whole coverage if you want to go through it in a lot more depth. On January the 22nd, 2019, Casey was 3 years old and was playing in his grandmother's back garden with two younger ones who were slightly older than himself. At 1:45 PM, they were all called indoors to have some dinner, and everyone but Casey made it inside. After realising everyone was concerned, and family members searched the property and the adjacent woods for 45 minutes but found no trace of him at all. Authorities were then contacted, and Sheriff Chip Hughes took charge of the situation, deploying search teams immediately. By nightfall, over 100 searchers were active, with the FBI then also joining the search effort after hearing about the circumstances. Overnight, the temperatures dropped to 24 degrees Fahrenheit or -4 degrees Celsius, with a lot of rain and harsh winds. Meaning that this was essentially going to guarantee hypothermia because Casey was only wearing a thin blue coat, trousers and shoes. Because of this, the search escalated and over 600 people, including Marine Corps personnel, were placed into the forest. Thermal imaging aircraft and professional search dog teams were deployed, but at no point was he spotted, nor was his scent found either. Authorities began to explore the possibility of foul play, though no evidence supported it. On the 24th, the downpour continued with heavy rain and strong winds, limiting the search to professionals only. Cries were heard in the forest, and Casey was found about a quarter of a mile from his grandmother's home inside the forest. Casey was entangled in briars. He was soaked and cold but talking. In order to reach his location, it meant passing through waist-high waters, which was taller than Casey himself, as pointed out by Chip. This then led Chip to say that Casey could not have been alone and that he must have been looked after and kept warm somehow. In the hospital, Casey stated that he had spent 2 days in the woods with a friend who was a bear. The searchers never found any evidence of a bear being present, nor did Casey smell as though he'd been with a bear for 2 days. Bear behavioural experts, including Chris Servheen, dismissed the possibility that he was with a bear, insisting that wild bears would not have protected a human being, and suggested that the story might reflect Casey's imagination, possibly being inspired by a teddy bear back home. I also find it interesting in this particular case that the search dogs never once found Casey's scent. Again, if you want the whole story in fine detail, then you can find links to my other videos in the description if you'd like to open a new tab. Now, that's enough about bears. Another odd case that has been cited was that of Lillian Carney, 6, who vanished while out berry picking with her parents near Masardis, Maine, around 15 miles west of the Canadian border. While not a national park, the Mullen Bog area was very remote and essentially wilderness. Lillian was picking blueberries, and somehow her parents had managed to lose track of her about noon that day. Her parents tried not to panic at first, but after their preliminary search had turned into an hour of just not being able to find a trace of her, one of them rushed to report what had happened while the other stayed behind to continue searching. The official search began very quickly, and by the following morning, there were said to be around 200 volunteers in the immediate vicinity of the disappearance. The forest areas of the bog were scoured, and at first they were not able to locate her, which worried everyone as midnight and the immediate darkness that comes along with it was approaching. The precise timing isn't known, and sources seem to vary slightly, but sometime between 48 and 72 hours after having gone missing, Lillian was found around 2 miles away by a searcher called Bert Pollard. After being safely returned to her parents and medical staff, she shared a bizarre detail of her time missing. She said that during her time spent missing, the sun was shining the entire time, despite the fact that she had been in the forest overnight, possibly 2 nights. people didn't really know how to take those comments and brush them off, and it is entirely possible that she was just mistaken about that. When something like this happens, especially to a young person who is not at all prepared for the kind of stress this situation would put them in, it's not difficult to imagine that being thrust into survival mode like this would have totally disoriented her, and could have made her lose a degree of lucidity. Some ideas that I've seen thrown around though were that she might have been referencing some kind of artificial light, but you wouldn't really find those back then, especially in an area like this where outside of berry picking, people wouldn't really have been there. It was a very odd thing to say though, and I'm sure it probably gave some people the creeps, because what light could she have been talking about? Speaking about the creeps, that segues nicely into this next incident. This young lad's name was never publicised, so we only know him as John Doe, 3, but John's incident reportedly occurred in September of 2011. John and his loved ones were having some family time at Fowler's Campground near the McLeod River right beneath Mount Shasta. At around 6:30 PM, his family realised that they'd lost track of him and began searching while calling out for him. About an hour later, they still hadn't located him, and according to this article by Mount Shasta News, emergency services were notified. The fire department, alongside police officers and the local sheriff's department, all turned out to search. Thankfully, this young Doe, whoever he was found, though the search took around 5 hours. And the success of the search can only be credited to the sheriff's search dog, that at some point was able to latch onto a scent trail. When he was found, it was described that he was only semi-conscious and in a bush, which was noted as being odd. Though I'd point out again that I could imagine someone so young being very highly affected by the amount of stress this kind of separation could cause, and might have been trying to hide in whatever state of disorientation, panic and confusion he might have been in. Thankfully, he had not sustained any injuries while missing, but he would go on to reportedly share something very unusual a week or so after the incident had taken place. He told his grandmother, Kathy, whom he called Cappy, that when he was in the forest, he was taken into a cave by a woman he thought was Kathy. He said that the cave was very dark and this woman had a sparkling light on her face. Inside the cave, he said there were spiders, cobwebs, bags and other abandoned personal belongings strewn about the place. He told his grandmother that there were other people just like this Cappy that had taken him present within the cave, but they were completely still and just stood around not moving or doing anything in the dark. Apparently, at some point later, Kathy recalled a strange incident that also occurred to her in Fowler's Campground. She said that she tried not to think too much about it initially until she thought more carefully about what little John had relayed. She had said that on a prior visit to the campground some years before, she had woken up face down in the dirt with no memory about what had happened or how she got there. She said that she had a small bite or puncture mark on her neck that she attributed to likely having been bit by some kind of bug that had caused some kind of health incident to occur. But after hearing what little John had said, wondered if there may have been something else, perhaps more unusual going on. It's important to note here that while I can point to the initial article reporting on this disappearance at the time in 2011, I have absolutely no idea where the rest of this information came from in regards to Kathy and the cave story. From what I can see online, some people have said that Kathy reported these details directly to David, though I don't know if that's the case or not, or if we've just ended up playing a large game of telephone where the information shared has slowly gotten stranger and stranger as the story has passed between people. However, even if that is the case, telephone is not needed in the slightest to make some of these strange disappearances appear to be more unusual, because some of them are just outright weird from the outset. For instance, not only do we have the occurrences of young people supposedly being taken by a bear numerous times, we also have highly unusual disappearances that have been reported on in great detail by the press, and myself actually in the past, such as Gaia Pope, that occurred here in the UK. I don't know if David has or would classify what happened to her under the criteria he looks for, but I certainly believe what happened to her fits the profile perfectly. Because I've covered this case in great depth before, I'll summarise in detail what happened, and we'll leave a link in the description below if you want to see my entire coverage. Gaia was 19 when she disappeared from Swanage, Dorset on the 7th of November 2017. She was last seen at 3:45 PM that day, and this spawned an absolutely colossal search effort for her as she was considered an at-risk individual. There was a heavy police presence, professional search and rescue teams, helicopters, search dogs, and many, many volunteers. Authorities had absolutely no idea whatsoever as to what had happened to her. They were completely stumped. Around a week later, on the 13th, they arrested a 19-year-old man and a 71-year-old woman, both known to Gaia but were later released as there was just no evidence whatsoever of any wrongdoing. To many onlookers, there was a lot of discussion about how those arrests seemed to be an act of desperation by the authorities because they had no answers and were dealing with a case that was growing rapidly in terms of public attention. A piece of CCTV footage showed Gaia running, seemingly from absolutely nothing. An area expanding well around the town and the coast itself had been searched right from the get-go already, and there were people all over the place around Swanage looking for her. On the 16th, her clothes, including her shoes, were found on a coastal path in the Dancing Ledge area, again, which had been previously searched many times over and over again. Professional searchers had been up and down these paths the entire time, but now, 9 days after she disappeared, there were her clothes, just strewn about. Search dog teams were immediately deployed to the area, but they found nothing else. They could not establish a scent trail. Gaia's cousin, Mariana, stated the following about this. "The police talked a good game. They told us they had dogs out and helicopters up with thermal imaging equipment so sensitive it could pick up a signal from a person who has passed away even up to 48 hours after the passing. One of the officers said to me, if she was there, we'd have found her." I can see precisely why the police would have felt that way, given that they were also dealing with the fact that the search dogs, which we as a society have been using for well over 400 years, despite their efficiency at this task, had not found a scent even once, despite having the clothes right there. 2 days later, on the 18th, Gaia's body was found, and I quote, "a stone's throw away from the clothing," near a cliff, again despite previous searches of the area. An inquest in February of 2018 found that Gaia had sustained no injuries at all, and initially Dr. Russell Delaney could not establish a cause of passing, but later said that it was likely as a result of hypothermia. This is interesting in and of itself, because usually the coroners like to be very precise and specific about such things. But in this instance, it seems that they were not 100% certain and were pointing towards this as the most likely outcome. While this may very well be the case when looking through the lens of Occam's razor, it still does not undo the weirdness of being found in the manner that she was, in an area previously searched over and over again. To be clear, there were no signs of foul play. Rightfully, as you might imagine, her family and others questioned how both she and her clothing could possibly have gone unnoticed during earlier searches, given the use of thermal imaging cameras and search dogs. Hypotheses ranged from paradoxical undressing to possible third-party involvement, but again, no evidence supported the latter. The police faced heavy criticism for their handling of the case, but I'm not entirely sure what else they could have done in this instance, aside from having much better communication with the family. We are left with a very strange incident in which there was a lot of speculation about the idea that Gaia might not have been in that area the entire time, had possibly been removed and later brought back, but with no plausible way that I can see of doing so, given how filled the area was with people looking for her. It remains to me one of the most unusual disappearances I have ever covered. As another example of why the game of telephone isn't required to make these cases sound off and unusual, we can have a look at the disappearance of David Horsey and Frederick Hardesty, two experienced bushmen and close friends from Fort Simpson in the Northwest Territories of Canada. In June of 2005, both of them vanished from a cabin 70 miles northwest of their hometown along the North Nahanni River within the Nahanni National Park Reserve. The cabin owner last saw them on the 12th of June, and by June 16 they were gone. The cabin was locked and their hunting equipment had been left behind inside it. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police initiated a search on June 18, but scaled it back after just 5 days, leaving volunteers and family to continue alone. On the 27th of June, David's body was found 2.5 miles from the cabin in thick brush, with marks on his hands and arms that were thought to be burns. His passing was attributed to hypothermia. 10 days later, on the 7th of July, Frederick's body was discovered floating 12 miles away in the river, with drowning listed as the cause. Both of them were found in areas previously searched multiple times, raising questions about whether they'd been missing or placed there later, though Frederick was likely swept away by the current. The RCMP ruled out foul play, citing no evident signs of a struggle on their persons. Family members of both David and Frederick later revealed very interesting details that had been ignored in initial reports. Inside the cabin, the families of the men stated that their hunting equipment had been discharged, I quote, all over the place, leaving holes in the walls, door, the ceiling, and even the floor, suggesting some kind of sudden and chaotic incident had taken place inside the cabin. The RCMP's constable, Brad Parker, had claimed that there were no apparent signs of a problem, a statement that clearly clashed with the details provided by the family of the two men. It has never been understood what happened to them inside the cabin. Was there an unknown third party present? Was there a panic, perhaps an animal or intruder prompting the chaos, followed by a frantic exit and separation? David's burns suggested that he may have tried to start a fire somewhere outside the cabin, but then for some reason abandoned the source of warmth that he'd just created. But why? Why split up and leave their means of defense behind inside the cabin after such an event? The locked cabin door also adds to this weirdness. Did they lock it after what had transpired inside, maybe trying to trap something inside the cabin? There was no evidence of a wild animal being present within, so that doesn't seem to be the case. The whole incident stinks of a sudden panic, but there was no indication as to what had actually caused the panic. To be clear, there was no evidence whatsoever that an altercation with another party had taken place. Both of the families made a push in 2018 to reopen the case, citing mishandled investigations and raising all of the unanswered questions, but to my knowledge, their efforts have not led anywhere. What in the world happened to them inside and then outside of that cabin? I would also point out that there are a lot of unusual things that have been said to have happened within the Nahanni National Park. So I'll leave a link in the description both to my full coverage of this case and my video on the park itself. The final disappearance that I'll add here is that of Ray Salmon. Ray was 65 years old and an experienced outdoorsman from Vancouver, Canada. He vanished on the 9th of June 2013 while camping alone at a remote spot on Harrison Lake in British Columbia's Fraser Valley. Known for his skills in camping, hunting and fishing, Ray had visited this exact location over 20 times in 20 years, often with his wife, Daniela. On this trip, he arrived on the 7th, 2 days before his disappearance, with his 2 dogs, Elmer and Bandit. He also had his truck, a camper, raft and ample supplies, planning to stay alone until the 10th when he was going to pick up his friend, John Miles, to explore some abandoned mines together. On the 9th of June though, a strange sequence of events unfolded. That evening, people heard 3 loud bangs in the area, suggesting that someone had ejected 3 shells. A couple were in a car on a nearby road that runs through the forest and their car had been hit, one of the headlights specifically. The RCMP responded to the complaint and then at some point found an abandoned campsite that they would later realise belonged to Ray. Strangely, his dogs had been locked inside the camper and there were no signs of him. This triggered a large-scale search effort involving search and rescue, helicopters, and unusually, a fully armed emergency response team. Though given what had happened, perhaps that may have been appropriate, I'm not sure. Despite Ray's expertise and the presence of his gear, including a raft with a motor and a life jacket, there was no clear evidence as to what happened to him. The search did reveal some odd details. Firstly, as said, Ray's dogs had been left behind, which was unusual as he typically took them with him everywhere. His belongings were found 400 metres north of the campsite on a secluded beach, including clothing and spent shell casings. The RCMP hypothesised that Ray may have been injured somehow, ejected shells to signal for help, and then attempted to swim back to camp, but drowned in the process. However, searches of the lake, including submersibles, never found a body. His wife and others questioned this conclusion, citing his preparedness and the fact that the boat remained at the campsite. Something perhaps even more unusual was found though. Ray had always carried, and had a means of defending himself while out in this place, and this item was found abandoned in a meadow up a mountain, a significant distance from the beach, his camp, and the other items. This raised a lot of questions, as it suggests that Ray, bizarrely, was on the move, perhaps in a panic state. Despite this, the RCMP stuck to their water-related accident. This struck a lot of people as highly unusual though, because Ray was a highly skilled, cautious outdoorsman, and something made him lock his dogs in that camper. His family stated that the only reason he would have done that was for their protection. But from who? What was this perceived threat? And during this ordeal, how in the world did he, or at least his equipment, end up in a meadow on a mountain? Some people believe, and I must admit, I share this speculation, that the headlight being hit could be a vital clue to the entire case. If it was Ray that did that, why would he recklessly open at a source of light? It could be the case that for some reason that must have been justified to himself. He perceived the source of light as a threat. It therefore could be reasoned that he had been spooked by an earlier light source unrelated to the car, which is why he locked the dogs away to protect them from something. Later on, after seeing a light again in the distance, he could have mistaken the headlights for the same threat that he had encountered, or at least perceived in the dark. A responsible hunter like Ray just opening at a vehicle for no reason is an uncharacteristic act, unless you conclude that he felt endangered for some reason. But if that truly is the case, then what form did this potential threat take? Was there another person, or perhaps a group of people in the forest with flashlights that were bothering or purposefully after him? Ray's brother, Bob, mentioned that he and his friend Otto had encountered some strange people in the past in that forest, and wondered if that had anything to do with it. The police concluded that there was no evidence of foul play or third-party involvement, but when you add up the various pieces of this case, something feels very out of place. And what I mentioned here were only a small number of some of the weird cases that I've covered over the years, both independently and as a result of the missing 411. On that note actually, I'll leave more links in the description with other specific cases that I've made a video on that have unusual elements to them. With that, I'll leave it there. Do let me know if you'd like another video like this where I go through and summarise a bunch of unusual cases. Anyway, I hope that you found this one interesting. I'd just like to take the time to thank you for watching, and a big thank you to the patrons who've been running around on the screen. If you found this video interesting, then please do remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you didn't like it, then feel free to give me a thumbs down. I'm just looking for your honest opinion either way. I hope that you've had a great day, or evening, depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Be safe guys. Peace.